Hello and welcome. My name is Yuri Mason and I'm the moderator of a new series, Artist in Conversation. It's a program by Dutch Culture, and with it we hope to learn more about the shared cultural and political predicament between the Netherlands and other countries. We do this by offering artists from different countries the opportunity to have conversations. Every edition of this series consists of two dialogues between an artist from the Netherlands and an artist from another country. Through mutual interest and sharing experiences, we hope to get to know not only the artist and their practices, but also the sector of the country, the environment they work in, and how that influences their practice. So today we are looking at Egypt. And to kick that off, let's have a brief look at the state of the country. And for that, we've invited Dalia Dawoud from the Dutch Embassy in Egypt. Dalia, are you here? I'm not sure. I have to say, I'm not sure. Is it Dawoud or Dawood?
It's Dawood, which is David in Arabic.
Very nice, Dawood. Mm-hmm. Great to have you. So I have a quite complex question for you to start off with. The state of Egypt. If you would try to boil down what is happening in Egypt at this moment in one word, abstract it down to its present state, how would you characterize the country at the moment?
Wow, that's tough. I would say complex. I see Egypt as a complex country with a lot of opportunities, it's very rich, it's very diverse, it has a lot of creative potential. It also has a lot of challenges, restrictions, censorship. So it's very complex. It's also very old, full of layers, everything and its opposite at the same time.
And for artists working in Egypt at the moment, what are kind of the things that would influence their practice? What dynamics are at play? Looking from a cultural policy perspective, that influences what artists, what the scope is of what artists can do.
Okay, artists in Egypt. They are restricted by censorship. They are restricted by lack of funding. They are restricted by absence of venues for performances, for urbanism and heritage. They are often restricted also by the amounts of government organizations and bodies involved in every steps, approvals, procedures, and so forth. But at the same time, considering that Egypt is both formal and very informal, this informality creates a lot of room to maneuver and do things. And this is where there is room to do a lot of things in all disciplines and all domains. I think COVID hardly influenced the sector, same in Egypt like in everywhere else. Some organizations had to close, others decided to travel and leave the country, but others, they continue. Unlike other countries, we managed to have many things happen, like festivals, governmental ones and independent ones, like the Cairo Jazz Festival, Animatex, Cairo Tronica, Panorama, Cairo International Festival. So we're restricted, but we have potential. I think artists also need more room for exposure, opportunities to practice, and to support them to do whatever they want to do without putting additional restrictions on the creative process.
So a platform to show what can be done, or to practice, you also said, right?
Yeah. Yes, to practice, to perform, to produce. Yeah.
And do you see any developments in that direction? Are you hopeful in a way?
Yes, we see a lot of development. So basically what the embassy is trying to do is to support the local scene. to help contribute to sustaining it, to give it room to organizations, to practitioners, to come up with new ideas, to support them, and to create rooms for exchange between Egyptians and Dutch, whereby it's a dialogue, it's a conversation. Let's work together onto doing something. And this happens in different forms, like, for example, co-creations, residencies, or performances, or after performances, you do workshops or talks, or for some projects like with Heritage, the Dutch come and contribute a missing component in a bigger program into how to develop a narrative for a site and so forth. So what we try to do is to support primarily local artists and practitioners and programs happening on the ground. We support different disciplines: visual art, digital art, performing arts, urbanism, heritage, tangible and non-tangible. Lately, we're getting into design, especially that also the Netherlands has a great edge in design, film, music. So we support those activities happening here, and we add to them meaningful exchange between local and Dutch practitioners. And I think so far we have been successful in doing this and making a difference. Sorry.
That's great to hear, and it's something that really ties into what we're trying to achieve today, also with this platform of conversations. Thank you, Dalia, for joining us. We're going to go to two conversations with artists from Egypt and the Netherlands, and thank you again. Please join me in welcoming our first guests, Mahmoud Khaled, artist, and curator Nat Muller. Hi, Mahmoud. Great
Hi.
that you're here. Hey, how are you doing?
I'm very good. How are you?
Fine, thank you very much. Where do we find you today?
In Berlin.
In Berlin, great. And Mahmoud, I think we'd like to invite you to share a picture that you wanted to submit, right, to kick off our talk. Please tell us, what are we looking at?
Yeah, it's this picture. It's a picture of a painting, and part of the collection of the Alexandria Museum of Fine Arts, in Alexandria. And first time I saw it was in 2013, I guess. I have a very special relationship with this painting, and it helped me a lot to get over a certain block that I was dealing with for a longer period, for a long period in the studio. The title of the painting is Painter on a Study Trip, and as we can see, we see a painter on a horse, in starting a trip in the nature, going to find a subject to paint, and his assistant is carrying all the material, the canvases, and the brushes and everything. So what I really love about this painting is that it's monumentalizing or commemorating the moment of starting a new artwork, the moment of starting the trip to look for a new subject, for a new inspiration. And this was the artwork itself. So we don't see a subject as such in the painting. We don't see like a model, like the models here, or the figures in the painting. They are not represented as figures, but they are represented as people looking for a subject. And this what actually opened a big door for me to rethink about all the stuff that has been, kind of delaying my productivity for a while, which of course it has a lot to do with the time. You have to put the context also for this. The blockage I was talking about is related to all the stuff that we dealt with after 2011, the demonstrations and the political uprisings and demonstrations in Egypt and in the region around it, and also in the world, in Spain and many other places. I think it was a very special timing for my generation that made us rethink all the stuff that we have been believing in art and politics, and even like the positions we used to speak from.
Yeah, in what way did it form a block for you?
Like in situations like this, you have to deal a lot with failure and death and like many like strong things that we're not, like I think my generation was not confronted with it before. And so we couldn't, like I personally couldn't just keep going as usual and go to the studio and find my own, like research subjects and motivations and interests. So there was also a question of what is the urgency of art, and all these like strong doubts that you deal with after certain major events. So that's why the visit to this museum was really good, because this painting was produced by an Italian painter who used to live in Alexandria in the late end of 19th century. And it was not considered as a major, like an important piece in the collection, but the conceptual impact of the work made a huge effect on me. And I used it as a point of departure for a solo show. It was my first exhibition in Egypt after this long period of, struggle and dealing with complications, political complications, and things that you need to understand as an artist and as a citizen. So that's basically the work that I wanted, the image that I wanted to share.
It's very interesting, and we're also looking at a not only the painting but also the painting as captured on your phone, right? Something I'd love to hear more about. But let's also bring in our other guest, Nat Muller. Nat, join us.
Hi.
Hi, welcome. Great that you're here. You've been listening, right, to what we've been saying so far. What kind of connections do you see when hearing what Mahmoud is talking about?
Oh, I was just surprised to hear you say, Mahmoud, that you experienced such a blockage because you've been so productive as I've been following your career in exhibiting. But I was actually interested to ask you, because since it's been a decade now since the uprisings in Tahrir, and that must have been quite a milestone in how you and your friends and your community have experienced it. So I was just wondering what that commemoration meant, and I also understand that when it all happened, people were so active and everyone went out in the streets. But is there now, after 10 years, a moment that you've been able to reflect more on what happened, and has that also found a way into your practice?
It's very funny, because now I feel like myself and many other people, also my colleagues and friends, we're dealing with, after 10 years, we're dealing with another blockage, but for completely different reasons, like the virus and the pandemic and the fact that life is on pause. And again, we had to re-question the urgency of art, and why are we doing what we're doing, and to whom, and the audience, and all this. So it was a bit, and especially, experiencing the pandemic in places in Europe, especially in Berlin, for example, where actually life was on pause for a long time. You're not allowed to see art. You can't go to museums, like all the stuff that we normally travel to Europe to do is like we're not allowed to do it. So this brought back this all these doubts and like the urgent questions to the floor again, like how to rethink what we're doing, and how can we again find urgency in this. So it's a cycle that took 10 years and came back like same set of questions, but for completely different reasons and on a completely different scale. Now I think we're dealing with it on a more like global and of course scientific health kind of thing, but it's also politicized, and they politicized everything around us. And of course, it's first of all, it's quite shocking to realize that it's 10 years has been passed. It went so fast, and we still, I think all of us were still trying to figure it out, like really happened, like a decade have passed, and I feel like with the way we think about political engagement and activism and social change and all these things is completely different, and also there's a lot of like new young artists and like new generation of activists and like artists, and they speak a different language, they have different statics, they have also a fresh way of thinking about activism. And so this is it was interesting to look back at all this and to realize all what happened, and how different we are and how different everything around us is.
And do you feel that that those 10 years of brewing of all these dynamics and politics, has that also seeped in differently into the art scene in Egypt? Because a lot of things have changed in terms of, I mean, the repression has gotten more harsher. Many institutions have also struggled, also in terms of getting foreign funding and all these curtailments. So has that also shifted that dynamic in cultural production?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it's something that like you can share with me, because you have experienced the art scene in Egypt in a certain time when things were completely different than now. So yes, actually this is quite heavy when I think about it. It's like it leaves me with like a heavy heart, and when I think about the situation right now, the scene is completely changed, not necessarily for better or worse, but it's not the scene that I signed up for. It's not the scene that me and my colleagues, we wanted to be part of, and we worked really hard to be part of. It's this is gone, and I'm not so happy about that, to be honest.
So what has come in its place? Where do you see the lack or the loss?
It's kind of like a depoliticized scene. I'm not saying that our like moment was super political, but there was like a lot of attempts to make it political and to engage with questions related to the contemporaneity of the city and the complexity of it and all this. But right now you have a lot of it's like a pure neoliberal kind of structure of a cultural production format. You have a lot of there's a lot of homes being built right now. We have a lot of compounds in the desert. The city is expanding, and these homes need art. People, they don't like to live in houses with white walls, and therefore they need a production that can cater this kind of production of homes and real estate companies and all this expansion of the city. And this is not necessarily something that I'm interested in. And it's okay, but I don't want this to be like the only kind of line or channel in the cultural scene. And also there's this kind of unspoken agreement between what are you doing and what the authority wants or agrees on. So there's like always like they need to go like hand in hand. There's very, very little room for confrontation, for controversy, which is something that we also like even during Mubarak, during before we really were thinking all the time how to play it correctly, how to speak about political issues without ending up in jail. And this is, I think, it's shaping the kind of statics that coming out of Egypt. But right now, I don't see this effort happening in the world.
Do you think that effort is possible now at this stage, or has it become so restrictive and repressive that room for maneuver is almost impossible?
I think, of course, it's harder than before, but I think every level of repression is pushing for different statics. But this work must happen, like how to understand the level of, power that you're dealing with, and how can you speak about that in a different way. I'm not saying, I mean, it's there. Of course, it's harder than before and things are completely different, but I think there's a very little, I'm trying not to be judgmental here, but it's, I see very little work happening in trying to deal with this power and to deal with this repression. Even it can be in a very poetic, gesture, you know, kind of thing, but it doesn't have to be like straightforward activism, of course. But this effort must be there. And that's what I think is lacking in the scene right now.
Hey, Nat, on that, we also asked you, when considering Egypt and the Netherlands, what image sprung to mind, what you would like to share? And you also submitted a particular image. What?
Well, not so much about Egypt. I was asked to submit a significant image, and admittedly, this is a bit of a lazy image because it's basically the view from my window, which has been the view for the past 16 months. And Mahmoud, I don't know how you have experienced the past 16 months, but I guess we're both in the art world and we're used to, in a way, hypermobility, hypervisibility, hyperproductivity, and then all of a sudden this pandemic happens. And none of that is possible, or at least none of that is possible as we're used to. Yes, I've basically not been able to move and travel. And what is different here is that I have plants. And I never had plants in my life because I was traveling too much. And all of a sudden, there was this real desire to bring life in a rather dark situation and green the four walls that have been, basically the place I'm thinking and you know, interacting with people over screens for the past 16 months. And you might, Mahmoud, also recognize the postcard, which is by Lebanese artist Mazen Kerbej. It's a funny postcard. It basically shows a guy in a bar, and it says Malik al-Bar, king of the bar, and something similar to I'll stop drinking when the bottles run out or when I get rid of the bottles. But it's also this postcard, which I got in Beirut in 2019, and there is perhaps a nice link with the uprisings in Egypt 10 years ago. The last time I was in Beirut in 2019 was when in Lebanon the uprisings started, which was also a very interesting example of a cross-generational, cross-sectarian movement of people getting out on the streets and having more than enough with the authorities and desiring justice and just a decent way to live, but which was also dramatically crushed. So I think it's also a reminder, it keeps also reminding me that sometimes I think the work of cultural worker ends and something else comes in that place. I think we saw that in Egypt when artists and cultural workers went out on the streets and were political agents rather than artists at that moment. And the same happened in Beirut, where everyone said, well, now is not the time for art. Now is the time for us to go out on the streets and have our voices heard in a different manner. And there was a lot of negotiation of, you know, how do we as an artistic community negotiate that and deal with that? And should we, you know, immediately, as we saw, so what happened in Egypt, react and make work? Because, you know, when a thing like this happened, very often foreign funders also jump in and want to have an immediate reaction. So I think these dynamics are really interesting to think of, but definitely now at a time of closure, let's say, or you know, where territories shrink physically, but I think also to an extent mentally because of the pandemic, it's good to see this wider picture and that dynamic.
Is it also, Mahmoud, to do with to do with that block you were talking about? Was it a block because you wanted to do something else, or?
It was just like I think the block was related to the complications of the situation. It's like everything's so complicated, and but complicated not not because, the politics are completely, difficult to understand, but also we're dealing with death and the normalization of death and violence as part of the process. And this was also hard to deal with. And as like we've been like raised up and like, especially during Mubarak for 30 years as like the peace generation, like we never experienced violence before. And this was the first time to see violence and death and blood as part of the daily life and as part of the process of social change. And so things were literally complicated. And it was just too much to process. And also, things were moving so fast, and like you don't have a position. Like I remember, I think like most of us as cultural workers, artists, we do have a position in the world. We have certain opinions about things, and we speak from this position, and that's what makes us have a certain language and things to say. It was very difficult to find this position during this process. Things were moving so fast, and you were doubting all your ideas all the time. So that's why I didn't know from where you can stand and speak as an artist. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah.
Very much. And the reality that seems so distant from what we are looking at from Nat's window sill. And
but I can relate to the window too. I mean, with the pandemic and the plants, yeah, it's totally, I totally understand what you're talking about, Nat.
Yeah, but also I felt I needed something also to, in a sort of micro level, to take care of.
Yeah.
Just to have something that you can just, water from time to time and see it grow. And because I think so much in our practice has slowed down, and that in and by itself is already disconcerting, because I think the art world can be seen as a quite rushed, high-paced environment, and all of a sudden that sort of sinks to an almost level of stasis, which is very disconcerting. But to a degree, and I don't know how you experienced that, Mahmoud, there's this continuous fear of missing out that the art world always whacks you on the head with. That was gone to an extent. So I don't know how you have experienced this, or were you also able to work? For me, the first few months were just scary. I was writing a chapter on the apocalypse, and we were living in the apocalypse, so that was also very strange somehow.
Yeah, it's so funny because all these things that we like, the images and the scenarios we used to have in our heads, like we used to read the novels and books about like the apocalypse and empty cities and the theatricality of whatever. All this was reality. Like all the things that we used to staticize in our work and our ideas and writings and stuff, it was actually like our cities were like this. Our cities were abandoned, deserted, totally. And we're talking about cities that we never experienced that way. So it was a bit kind of like, it was a bit surprising. It was quite uncomfortable to deal with for a while. But I was not able to work, to be honest. No, it was a bit of like, again, I dealt with another block for completely different reasons. But the good thing is that I had a book to work on, so it was nice to work on a book, not an exhibition or something physical that requires audience. So it was nice to work with writers and my co-editor and editing text and doing Skype meetings. So it felt quite suitable for the situation to be locked in a room and working on ideas with other people via screen. But now I feel, it's been like we're almost finishing the second year. Yes. And it feels like, I feel like I'm like a different person from the person who used to be, before, like biennials, art fairs and flight tickets and stuff like this. Yeah. Like, I don't like, we all changed, and it feels like another life, like it's very far away, like,
I also wanted to ask, because you've been in, for the whole duration of the pandemic, you've been in Germany.
In Cairo.
In Cairo.
Yeah.
But now you're in Berlin doing a residency, and maybe as a sort of closing point to discuss, a lot of your work also delves into queer politics. And I was just wondering, you spoke about how artists in Egypt have always found ways how to bring certain contentious issues into their practice poetically or covertly or in a very sort of complex way. And does being in Berlin change your practice when you work, for example, on queer politics? I mean, knowing your work, I suppose there's also some projects that you would not be able to show in Cairo or in Egypt. So I was just wondering about that dynamic, because I very fondly remember the fantastic project you did for the Istanbul Biennial in 2017, which very much touched on that topic, but was also, you had to understand the cultural references in a sense to get the full narrative.
Yeah. No, thank you for the questions. It's complicated because I understand. Yeah, I understand this. I always think that the fact shaped my work a lot. The fact that I'm working from Egypt, and I do like most of these ideas coming from Egypt. The way I think about queer identity and sexuality and all this within the Egyptian context and from within the Egyptian context, it shapes the work in a different way, and it comes up with like aesthetics that I wouldn't be able to produce if I'm working from San Francisco, for example. And this is something I value a lot right now. I mean, at this point of my career, I appreciate the value of this. Before, I wasn't aware of it. First of all, I feel like all the works are like any work I produce or I work on, I always think that it's possible to show in Egypt. I want to believe that it's possible to show, unless it's conceptually designed not to be shown in Egypt, like the Istanbul piece, because it's about exile. So it can happen anywhere in the world except Cairo, because it's about leaving home. But any other work, and I managed somehow to show most of the works in Egypt in different situations, and it was okay so far. So, but I always want to believe that it's possible to do to show it in Egypt, because it shapes the work in a different way. If I remove this from the work will become like something else.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
it's also been a very rough year, I think, for the LGBTQI community in Egypt, with the suicide of Sarah Higazi, the activist, and Mashrua Leila, you know, the Lebanese band, which is headed by a gay frontman, being banned. So that was also very much a discussion point, I think, the past year as well, no?
Absolutely. And again, like we're talking about generations and new generations doing things in a different way. I wouldn't like think about how they come up with solutions, how they defend their arguments and debates and political debates and stuff like this. And this is something I'm really learning a lot right now, all the time. And it's kind of troubling me as an artist in a good way as well. So it's not just like, you know, because sometimes then also people think that being queer is enough. You know, it's not enough. It's like there's a lot of it's like an ongoing complication that you need to deal with, and you need to listen to how like new people are speaking about it as well. So yes, it's been a tough year, and also for my generation, just to close this on this note. For my generation, we feel like we had like somehow worked for like substantial amount of time, like let's say 10 years or something on a certain thing in order to understand it. And that's never enough. When you finish, like at some point you feel like all your argument is very old dated, and there's a new generation speaking about things in a different language. And you actually have to re-question everything. Mm-hmm. And also things happening, like the Queen boat that happened 20 years ago. This year was the 20th anniversary. And the Queen boat, if people don't know about it, it's like the Egyptian, it's considered like the stone wall of Egypt, like the most important event in the queer community, queer history. So
when many gay men got arrested on a boat, basically.
Yeah, 52 men. So if this is the iconic event that we are still, after 20 years, trying to work on, reflect on it, process it, trying to learn how to speak about it, how to document it, how to narrate it for ourselves, for next generations, whatever. And then in the meantime, a lot of things has been happening that you need to also focus on, like Sarah Gazi, the Mashroua Laila, and many other raids, and that was like orchestrated in different ways. So it's quite tough, you know, like the whole thing. But that what makes you also, you know, inspired and working in a way.
It's a wonderful note to close on, Mahmoud, and I could have spoken with you for many, many more minutes. So I think we need to close. Yes, we need to meet soon in real life.
Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you so much, Mahmoud, Nat, for joining us and for this inspiring talk. Lots of connections to be made. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to continue with two further guests we brought on. The first guest is Michelle Provost. She's an architectural historian specialized in urban planning history, post-war architecture and urban development, and she co-founded the Office of Crimson Architectural Historians in 1994. Welcome, Michelle. Great to have you. And our second guest, Omar Nagati, an architect and urban planner who co-founded Cluster, an urban design and research platform in downtown Cairo. Hello, Omar. How are you? We are not hearing you at the moment, Omar. Is something with your...
Yeah, I just turned...
Perfect. Where do we find you at the moment, Omar and Michelle?
Well, I'm in Rotterdam at my house.
In Cairo. Yeah.
In Cairo, great.
Yeah, I'm in Cairo. We, as you said, we were located in downtown for 10 years. We just moved outside downtown for a reason we can talk about. So I'm in a new space, and I just installed my library in the back, which wasn't there.
I see there's a clear connection already in the background. Hey, we invited you to share a significant thing with both of you. I'm going to kick off actually with a video that you.
Super diversity, crime, the edge opportunity.
What I want to explore with my project is to offer perspectives, the bird gaze, how these animals are actually perceiving the city from above, but also from the pavement.
It focuses on a specific location in Rotterdam, which is the Wena Street, and on 3 different speculative projects.
So in this pocket guide of Getting Lost, I have focused a lot on the visual language.
I developed a board game, it's called Anthropocity, and the intention is to help people envision and debating different attitudes towards sustainability in the city.
So you have this really stark contrast between people just passing by and going to the cars and these like really precious objects that play beneath.
There is a disconnection between the Rotterdam harbour and the city of Rotterdam, between different migrant groups in the city, and what especially interests me, between nature and culture, between humans and non-humans.
You're right that there will be a denier in all of us, but what I believe is that there's also a post-humanist in all of us, and that's also something what brings us together.
Yeah, I thought I should show you this, Omar, because I think we met before. I'm not sure in what year, but it's a couple of years ago, and we talked about the plans that we had for starting a school, and now it's started, so I can tell you everything about it, but maybe it was easier for you to understand what we're actually doing by showing this small clip. And I think the whole period of Corona was for a lot of people a sort of a seizure, a completely different world. Also, the lack of a lot of things. But for us, it was because of this school. It was something completely different. It was like a moment in time where we could actually concentrate, and we decided to just move forward with these activities, and have 3 months of really concentrated thought and discussion, and create this learning community. So I actually really enjoyed it, and I hope you did something. Something similar maybe, or something. I'm not sure how your time was, but
yeah. Well, I mean, thank you for sharing this. Yeah, of course. I recall our encounter in Cairo a couple of years ago, right before the corona started. We did discuss possible collaboration, and I think this is very appealing. And I'm really jealous. I would like to join at some point. But I would like maybe to step back and maybe build on the conversation between the previous two artists, which was in a way set the context, set the stage for what we're talking about. I think we can always talk about the last year and a half and Corona, but I think from Cairo, and I think globally, we need to look at what is wrong with our cities even before Corona. I think there is as the previous guest said, there is a sort of a neoliberal paradigm that is governing our cities, and it's been there for 3-4 decades. And creating all these conditions of injustices from housing and transportation and services, including the art culture scene. So I think people tend to think of the global South and the global North, or Europe and the Middle East, are having very distinct conditions. Of course, there are specific conditions for each, but there are also a lot of common grounds I think we need to acknowledge and in a conversation. And I think this is, I would like maybe that's sort of a segue to a project that we had started 3 years ago with the Dutch support to look at what we call grounded urban practices. And that's a discussion I would like to maybe engage Michelle, because the independent school to me is a manifestation of that. What grounded urban practices is, by definition, is our alternative initiatives and practices engaging the cities that are in a way fed up with the corporate mainstream neoliberal paradigm and trying to do something that is critical, is experimental, but it's also that is grounded or community-based. And I think this project that we started, we looked at Cairo and Amsterdam and Rotterdam comparatively, and we produced a publication. I'm just going to show you a quick image of it. Here it is. And we did mapping of maybe a dozen or so as samples of initiatives in Cairo and Amsterdam, Rotterdam. And after that, we did in Berlin, and now we're doing in Bogota. We think this is a global movement. There is this interest in developing alternative frameworks and vision. And I think maybe Michelle, you can tell us a little bit about the independent school. What was the vision behind the school, and what is the modus operandi? How did you develop the curriculum? How do you select the instructors? What is your business model, which is very important, because we all want to do something alternative, but it's not sustainable. It's always dependent on grants. And so maybe you can talk to me a little bit about the specific mechanics of the school. Maybe you can copy that in Cairo.
Yeah. Can you copy that in Cairo? That's a good question. Well, actually, we started it. It was not our first choice. The first choice was actually to look for a position in the university, preferably the Technical University of Delft, to get a position there and to teach what we have been practicing over the last 20 years, which is a combination of critical engagement with societal issues, but rooted in an awareness of history and culture. And we were unable to find such a position, and after trying for quite some time, we decided, okay, then we'll start our own school. So we basically started without a business model, and while this sounds very unwise, I think it is in fact the secret behind all of our projects, not so secret anymore, because I think just to start a project like that and to invest in it yourself, and then by showing to other people that it is something worthwhile, that is when you get support for it. So we basically started in 2018 organizing different courses in studios, but we had to tweak it a lot. But without going too much into the details, it developed into a school which is supported by architectural offices in Rotterdam. That are sort of members of our school and that support us financially. The participants in our studios also pay a fee, but we keep it very low because, of course, we don't want to keep it as open to anybody as possible. And we get subsidies from funds that are from the municipality and from national funding. So that is the business model by now. But to go back to the content, we were our main course that you just saw the clip of is called Dirty Old Town, and it's a reaction, also a critical stance towards the direction that many cities are taking. Maybe you know also of the Smooth City project by Failed Architecture by René Boer. All of our cities are sort of cleaning up their centers. And all of the I'm talking about Western European cities now. So they attract visitors, tourists, expats, and they have cleaned up their act and even become sort of a city lounge, a green city. Well, you know all the marketing slogans, but the periphery of our cities is also slowly sort of morphing into, I'm not going to say the sort of the garbage bag, but everything that is not fitting in this smooth image is sort of pushed out. And this dirty old town that, by the way, we love, that is the kind of ambiguity that in the city makes the identity and creates this the deeper rooted identity of the city. That is what we love, and that is what we want to investigate. And that is why you saw in the clip these three issues. The inequality that is part and parcel of all our cities. How does it manifest itself in the city, and what can you do against it? Super diversity and migration, and the Anthropocene. Which proved to be quite, I think the last theme, the Anthropocene, was actually the most eye-opener of these themes. I can tell you a little bit more about it if you want to, but I think especially this inequality and finding alternatives to these neoliberal practices that our cities are being built with, that is a huge topic in our different studios. So the financial mechanisms, for instance, behind it.
Fascinating. Well, I mean, this is a very interesting point of connection, because you're talking about sanitizing the center and turning it into a space for tourism, etc., and then pushing all the dirt and all the sort of unnecessary or undesirable activity to the outside. In Cairo, we're having something a little bit of reverse, but it's also similar in a way. And if I may elaborate and maybe connect to Mahmoud's comment. Now, 10 years ago, we had a political upheaval, and we were all part of it. And that's what's happening mainly, not exclusively at the city center, Tahrir Square and downtown. The new states, after the revolution, took notice of that and realized that the city center is too messy and potentially also dangerous, because it's unruly, etc., etc. So over the past, let's say 6-7 years, there has been a very systematic attempt to relocate the city center to a new capital, but also new suburbs. And in doing so, there is two things are happening. A, to hollow out the city center, to move all the ministries or the museums or the big headquarters, etc., cultural centers to the outside, banks, etc. And conversely, try to stand downtown into like an open museum, like beautiful architecture, but it's completely sanitized. No street vendors, no activists, no troublemakers. No. So I would like maybe use this opportunity to maybe show a small clip of a project that we started with when we first started in 2012 after the revolution. And in a way, it could be an entry point to this question of what do we do with the city center? And in a way, dovetails with a larger question, which is also another commonality with informal urbanism. In the global south, we can talk about housing and street vendors, and in Europe, we can talk about migrants, informal sort of markets, etc., etc. So maybe if somebody can help us to show this 1 minute clip. So what you see here is a time lapse of 1 minute of 24-hour cycle of a sidewalk. This used to be our office from our balcony. And what you can see here is a very interesting pattern of informal actors organizing themselves internally and responding to a lot of things, to passers-by, to traffic, to police raid, to rain. And it is, in a way, portrayed as chaotic, as undesirable, messy things. But there is an underlying structure in informality that try to capture here. And we've done a lot of work about analyzing the rule system governing this, like who cleans after, who decides the distance between them, etc., etc. And what's really interesting about this project is street vendor, because they of course represent the informal economy, which is 50% of GDP. But more importantly, is that street vendor occupy usually the sidewalk, and that's a clear distinction between Egypt and the global south and Europe, is the margin between the private and the public. And in Amsterdam and Berlin and Northern Europe, it's more regulated, sometimes over-regulated, right? You know what's possible, what's not possible. Whereas in Cairo, there's a gray zone of possibilities. And what you can do, cannot do, depends on many things. Depends on who you are, which time of the day, your gender, class, subject position, etc. Who are you going to, etc. And to me, this kind of contingency or fluid space is something we want to explore by looking at street vendors as an entry point. Anyway, I just want to maybe throw that back to you. And because we are now, as Mahmoud says, we're 10 years after, many things have changed, but informality is here to stay. And it's still a big question with the state. What do you do with informality? If 70% of the city is built outside planners, with outside architects, you cannot get rid of it overnight. It's 4 decades of accumulation. And there's an image, maybe Kaya can share it, with the public, with the informal housing. So you cannot really get rid of it, but you cannot also accept it as an alternative because it's very conservative. It's about private actors pursuing private interests. So there's a role of the state, but it has to be a democratic, strong state. So maybe you can tell me a little bit about the policy, public policy and urban policy in the city center, and how are you guys dealing with it as a practitioner, but also as an academic?
Yeah, but first, I'm wondering, because this time lapse is fascinating, of course. You can watch it over and over again because so much happens. And there's so much actors who all have their own role, like you're saying. And it's, in fact, a very organized thing. But if you say you can't get rid of this informal housing and environment, etc. So apart from creating awareness of it, what actually do you want to, is there something you want to achieve with portraying this and creating this awareness?
Yes, that's a very important question. So our approach is, as I said, we cannot romanticize informality because it's not an answer. It's very conservative. You need a guardian of public good, the state, right? But you cannot also get rid of. So what do we do? So what we're doing in our work is try to first engage it and understand how it works, the underlying system, right? Whether housing, street vendors, whether traffic, etc. And he said, if this practice condition is going to be there for the next 10 to 20 years or so until the state is back, and the first thing is to unlock it, to understand it, unravel it, because we don't study it at school. It's completely dismissed as chaotic, as negative, After you do that, you try to develop ways for you to work with it, intervene critically, but also on a very small scale. So we did a project with ETH in Zurich called Housing Cairo, where we worked with the students for 2 years in an informal area. We tried to understand the typology of this housing structure and what would be ways to, improve it from an environmental perspective, from privacy perspective, just a little bit improvement without disrupting the whole system. So rather than raising the whole thing and building a new capital or a new district on the tabula rasa, you accept that this is already has its own intelligence, but there is room for improvement, and that's the role of us, to work with the local actors, contractors, residents, community leaders, and introduce some ideas to make their existing project that is happening on the ground already as we speak, to make it a bit better. And that's, to me, our approach to the city.
Yeah. I think the difference that you painted between the formal and the informal systems in Cairo is so huge. It's hard to imagine from a Western European perspective. With the state, what is this organization called again? The state organization that is in charge of all the housing, sort of completely cynical. Transforming the city in a way that everything new, all housing, all shiny things are put outside. I was also struck by this insistence on heritage in Cairo that you have, because when I was there and lecturing on these new towns around Cairo that have been built there in the last 20-30 years, I remember this one reaction of the students, which were housed in one of those completely new concrete barren places in the desert. And she asked me this question. I was completely surprised. She said, "But if you're building a completely new town, why do you want to insist on keeping your heritage? You want everything shiny new, right?" Because I was advocating this sort of layered approach and she didn't understand. We didn't understand each other at all. And with your insistence on heritage in the downtown Cairo, I was wondering what kind of reaction do you get? Is it really
Yeah, I mean that's an excellent comment from that student. I think the mainstream understanding of heritage as a static, stylistic artifacts. So there's a new classical building that needs to be restored, hollowed out from the residents, and come back to what it used to be, perfect Belle Epoque, right? And that's very problematic because it takes away all the social and economic factors in that building. Mm-hmm. Our approach to heritage is that we acknowledge that it's a living heritage, and downtown has multi-layers of, class and demographics and gender, etc., etc. And that's already part of the heritage. So downtown is not one layer; it's many. It's like 250 years of layers. So some shops went out and new shops came in. Some residents built on the roof, etc. We would like to maintain that, but regulate it. So we think it's the charm and the interest in an old city, not only in Cairo, it's accumulation. And to think of it as a process, a living organism, rather than turn it into an empty museum that is clean and shiny, but it's boring. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, but only I don't have to preach that in the Netherlands because this is consensus in the Netherlands. But there's one thing in which Egypt and the Netherlands also have some similarity, though also very incomparable. But this balance between formal and informal. There is no informal sector really in the Netherlands or in Western Europe because, we are very regulated and sometimes over-regulated. But to a degree, this also poses a problem because the way that our cities grow and are being transformed and that the way that housing is developed is also regulated in a way that communities or informal parties, I would say individuals or small collectives, are completely ruled out and they don't get a seat at the table. So it's only big developers, governments, cooperations, and so there's no place for a really democratic urban development. And that is also something that we're at the school that we're trying to do, like come up with housing cooperatives, for instance, like collectives building their own buildings, all these things that Cairo exists. Well, also the 70% of informal development of Cairo is to some degree highly capitalistic. It's just not
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the question of informality within the global north is something we've been trying to understand, and maybe that's something we can work on. But I think the last decade or so, with these kind of waves of immigrants coming to Europe, they're bringing with them their own understanding of public space, right? And that sometimes is in conflict with the a norm, right, in these cities. So I think it would be interesting to investigate how some certain neighborhoods and the streets, like in New Köln in Berlin, just to give an example, what is the difference between a sidewalk in New Köln and a sidewalk in the city center, right? And without judging it, good or bad, like what are the different ways of people engaging, understanding, and approaching the public space? And that could be an interesting point to open up this debate and maybe unravel some of this over-regulation in the city. But it's definitely seems very different from Cairo, which needs more regulation on this side, and maybe in Europe it needs to be a little bit deregulated. And that's something we can, from a spatial perspective, not economic perspective. I think economically, I'm pro-regulation.
No, of course, it's also a systemic question and economic, because also I don't want to romanticize the informal. It's just about sort of releasing the iron fist that the real estate sector has on our cities, which is by now really grabbing everyone's attention because of the housing prices, which are soaring, and nobody can afford to live in the big cities like Amsterdam, for instance, but also Rotterdam anymore. So that asks for different approaches. But I do agree with this use of public space, which transforms in such a strong way from the city center, moving outwards, connecting to different migrant communities, etc. So that is extremely interesting. And especially because you're now also working in other North African countries.
Yes. Yeah, we have projects in Tunis and Morocco and also Sub-Saharan Africa. So we started to go regionally in the past few years to sort of find alternatives to not able to do a lot of work on the ground. I think we're getting a note from the moderator that we're out of time, but it's been a pleasure to talk to you again, Michelle. I really hope this would trigger collaboration soon. Once this once the travel restriction is lifted, we can find a way to do something together. Great to talk to you.
Do that. It's high. Okay. It's time.
It's time. Yes.
That's right. It's my dishonorable duty to signal the time. Thank you so much. What an inspiring conversation. It just goes to show how much the cultural and the political are intertwined, but also the formal and informal in quite contradictory ways. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Omar.
My pleasure.
This also brings us to the end. Thank you, Omar. This also brings us to the end of this first series of Artists in Conversations. Once again, a big thanks to Mahmoud, Nat, Dalia, Michelle, and Omar for joining us today. And thank you all, you viewers, for watching. The next edition, we will talk with artists from Australia. We hope you enjoyed it, and see you next time.